Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week's topic is functional money. The reading for this week is a paper I presented at a symposium last month entitled A Functional Approach to Money. I like to say that you can't understand basic income without understanding money, so I'm going to give an overview of what my understanding of money is, and then we can connect that up to basic income. So what is money? Well, it will always be true that a market economy requires a fixed frame of reference against which to set and pay its prices. That's money. Money is two things. It's both the standard unit in which markets set their prices and also the standard value tokens we spend to pay those prices. For the purposes of this talk, the unit is the money unit and the tokens are money tokens. You spend your dollars, money tokens, to pay dollar prices. A $5 note can purchase a $5 sandwich. In this sense, money is what we spend to buy stuff. The adoption of a single pricing standard allows market participants to speak each other's language. Money, specifically the money unit, functions as the language of trade. This is why money exists. Without a common money unit, markets can't set prices, supply can't meet demand, and trade breaks down or fails to establish itself in the first place. With good reason, history has never seen any large-scale economies with goods priced directly in terms of other goods. Be it ounces of gold, dollars, or something else, the market will coordinate on a pricing standard. When we hear money described as a medium of exchange, what we're really talking about is money tokens. These are easily traded objects that represent a fixed number of money units worth of purchasing power. Money tokens are what resolve the so-called double coincidence of wants. Everybody wants money tokens, and they serve as a useful intermediate exchange medium precisely because they're denominated in the pricing unit. But not all money tokens are the same. Money tokens form a hierarchy, with the tokens at the bottom corresponding to what we would normally think of as forms of credit. At the top of the hierarchy sits the base money token, which forms the basis for the money unit. Subordinate money tokens, such as bank deposits and other forms of credit, are ultimately promises to pay base money tokens. Subordinate tokens are denominated in the standard money unit and, in many contexts, are freely interchangeable with base money tokens and with each other. The base money tokens and the subordinate money tokens are all ultimately the same kind of thing. In his paper, The Inherent Hierarchy of Money, Perry Mehrling says, "We want to avoid sterile debates about what is money and what is credit, and stand instead on the point that the system is hierarchical in character." When people save money, they prefer to hold assets that provide a positive return over time. That is, you won't get the best bang for your savings buck by stuffing cash in your mattress. In his Money and the Mechanism of Exchange, William Stanley Jevons says, money is made to go. People want coin, not to keep it in their own pockets, but to pass it off into their neighbors' pockets. Another way to put this is that money is the thing you spend, not the thing you save. Most people aren't going to save money by stuffing it in mattresses, but maybe they would if those mattresses paid interest, right? Well, that's what treasuries are. Treasuries are mattresses that pay interest. A money token that pays enough interest can serve as a decent savings instrument. But the money tokens that we hold for savings, like treasuries, are generally not the same ones that we spend for payment. People need to be able to reason about market prices without worrying about the unit in which those prices are expressed. And ideal money remains as neutral as possible. It sits outside the influence of market forces. It is exogenously stable. In the absence of market-wide institutions, the market will tend to settle on a widely valued commodity as its base money. But government institutions, if available, are in a position to use macroeconomic policy to ensure a money's stability. They can create a near-perfect commodity for use as the market economy's base money token. Fiat money is a special kind of synthetic commodity money whose stability is managed by institutions. A well-managed fiat money system will always win out against a natural commodity such as gold. Only with fiat money are there institutions standing at the ready to push back against market forces that would otherwise move the price of the money itself. If the state hopes to remain the issuer of its economy's base money, it must maintain a stable standard of value. This price stability constraint binds fiscal and monetary policy. If our institutions fail to honor this constraint, the market will find something else to use as its money. But there is a tension in the way we've set up our monetary policy. If we put the central bank in charge of maintaining the stable level of consumer prices, as we do today, then that limits what they can do with respect to facilitating the financial sector's smooth functioning. For example, the central bank can't easily prop up consumer prices while simultaneously tightening lending conditions to prevent an unstable expansion of private credit. So we know that subordinate money tokens, such as bank deposits, are promises to pay base money tokens. But in any monetary system managed by institutions, whether based on a physical commodity or a fiat token, base money tokens represent a promise too, the promise of price stability. So-called inconvertible notes are still convertible in the broad sense that the government is making a promise about what the market will sell you. And they're keeping that promise by using macroeconomic policy to ensure a stable price level. Base money tokens and all money tokens are promises to pay goods. The economy is a machine that produces goods and services for consumers to buy. Money tokens flow from consumers to producers to claim goods and services flowing in the opposite direction. A stable price level implies that the flow of money tokens, spending, remains proportional to the flow of goods, economic output. If one of these flows moves, the other must adjust to match. The important insight here is that managing the token flow doesn't mean just managing the flow of base money tokens. It means that institutions must manage general spending, regardless of whether those institutions issued the particular tokens being spent. Tokens all up and down the hierarchy matter. The so-called chartalist view of Georg Friedrich Knapp insists that the value of base money comes from the state and its laws. The opposing so-called metalist view insists that the value of base money comes from the intrinsic value of an underlying metal or commodity. There are certainly contexts in which either or both of these stories are relevant to the functioning of a monetary system, but neither one tells us about why money must function the way it does. A money token can get its value through a number of different proximate mechanisms. What ultimately matters is that the value of the base money token, along with its accompanying hierarchy of subordinate tokens, remains sufficiently stable to serve as the basis for the economy's money unit. Price stability helps us understand why gold and silver were appealing standards in contexts where institutions hadn't fully matured. The prices of these metals are reasonably stable compared to other commodities we might choose. In this sense, the metalists are right. We can also sympathize with the chartalist perspective. Well-functioning institutions can keep a money unit artificially stable. Then again, a poorly managed fiat money can quickly deteriorate to being worse than gold. We can only ascertain the essential nature of money by examining its necessary function in the economy. Money is what it does. It is defined by its function. Legal history can describe the process by which our institutional machinery came to be, but it cannot explain the underlying reason for money. Ultimately, neither side sees the forest for the trees. Chartalism and metallism are both wrong. The nature of money derives neither from the state and its laws, nor from commodities and their physical properties. The nature of money derives from a computational complexity problem that any large-scale market economy must address. Perry Mehrling's money view examines the plumbing of money tokens, which appear as assets and liabilities on the financial sector's balance sheets. He emphasizes that abstracting away from this plumbing misses essential insights about the constraints that financial markets face. Instead of treating money as a veil to be seen through, the money view treats money tokens in particular, as the central object of study. We do need to be aware of the plumbing, but only in contexts where we face the costs and constraints imposed by the veil. Money's defining characteristic is that the goods market can use it as a neutral standard of value. Its veilness lies at the very heart of its function. There are many answers to the question of what money is, but there's just one answer to the question of why money is. Only by examining the primary function of money can we understand the implications of and the limitations to manipulating it. The market will find a stable standard value unit of account against which to set its prices, along with corresponding standard value money tokens with which to pay those prices conveniently. Money's price stability can originate from the promises and actions of government institutions, from the universally accepted value of a particular commodity, or from a combination of both. The purest form of money is whichever one the market chooses. We don't want our money to get in the way of our real economy. So how can our institutions manage our money such that our desired social outcomes are constrained only by our economy's real productive potential? Properly functioning money allows prices and quantities to adjust to clear individual markets. But at the level of the macroeconomy, prices, either real or nominal, cannot adjust. So quantities have to do the heavy lifting. But how can quantities adjust when the price level is fixed? And why would they? By understanding money's function as an exogenously stable building block, we can begin to fruitfully explore these types of questions.
Interesting. So thanks again for doing this. I've heard you read this paper before. You say that you're defining money in terms of its function. I'm curious, if not with respect to its function, how would you say that other people today are defining money?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because there are a lot of different ones. The three standard things that people say are unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. So store of value, clearly anything you have that's valuable, you can hold on to it, and that's a store of value. So that's not something that's unique to money or special about money as such. What's special about money in its capacity as a store of value is that it's a standard store of value. And that's kind of the common thread linking these three things. So medium of exchange, you and I could use any intermediate good that we both, wanted to trade in terms of, but the idea is that in order for the large scale market to function as a whole, it's got to be a standard medium of exchange that everyone accepts. So that's kind of the medium of exchange part. But again, the standard is what's underlying it. And then in terms of the unit of account, everyone could use different accounting units, but we can all kind of coordinate with each other better if we have a standard accounting unit that we all use. So underlying the three functions that other people talk about, or that economists usually bring up, is this standard. That's the common thread, that it's a standard of value. And you hear other things like I talked about chartalism and metalism in the talk. So the chartalists say that money is fundamentally, well, especially the MMT, modern monetary theory people, say that money is fundamentally a tax credit. So whatever the government is making you pay in taxes, that's going to be the economy's money. But that doesn't really tell you about the function of money beyond what the government is using it for. So the government's using money to provision itself and using taxes to provision itself. And that's fine, but there's a reason why they're using this same standard unit that everybody else is using. And then the metalists, they're basically telling a story. Both the chartalists and the metalists are telling a story about how money gets its value or why it's accepted. But more important than that, I mean, both of those stories are true to some extent, but more important to that is that it is accepted as the standard, and people are using it as this standard pricing and payments mechanism.
So that's a good overview of the different competing definitions. And I think it's important for people to be aware of that. There's a landscape of different theories out there. But I guess my question is, if you ask someone who believes that, say, money defines money as a store of value, would they say that that's its function? Or is it the case that most people are kind of picking a special characteristic for some other reason? Do economists think of money having a function, or is it thought as something else, like a natural feature?
I think economists usually think of money as having a function, and then these three things, unit of account, medium of exchange, store of value, are kind of its three functions, but they don't necessarily kind of bring it all together the way I do. And in particular, they're not starting with the function, they're starting with a description of what they see it doing. So they see it storing value, they see it being used as a medium of exchange, and they see it being used as a unit of account. So like, okay, that's what money is. That's what I'm looking at, that's what I'm seeing, so that's what I'm describing. And the MMTers see money being taxed, and so they describe it as being a tax credit. So there's all these different kinds of ways to describe what you're seeing, and none of them are really wrong. But in order to really understand the nature of money, you have to understand what's essentially true about money. Or to put it another way, other people can describe money however they want, and that's fine. But it's, as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's always going to be true that the economy needs a pricing and payment standard. So that's the thing that I choose to describe as money, and that's the thing that I'm interested in studying and understanding. And it happens to be that this thing is the thing that corresponds to all the other things that people describe as money.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think, I try to keep in mind the perspective of ordinary people, because I think a lot of people might not be thinking about money as having a function or something that would have a function. For a lot of people, I think money is just something that you deal with. Like, it's something that is a big part of society, and you just have to manage your money however best you can. And people aren't really thinking of it as solving a problem, right? Like a pricing system is solving a problem. Do you see that as something primarily that solves a problem, has a function for the ordinary users of a currency, for ordinary people? Or is this more like on a higher level, whoever's managing a monetary system, is that where it becomes clearer that money has this function that you talk about, the standard of value function?
So I would say that money always has the function. Like the analogy I was using was that it's the language of trade. We all have to kind of speak the same language in order to interact with each other efficiently. But I would agree with you that ordinary people don't really think too deeply about money. They just think of it as something they get and something they spend to buy things. And that can lead to some weird ideas. So people see some problems that they associate with money, and they're like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could have, a world without money? Like the Star Trek future tries to imagine, that they have no money in their world and that kind of thing. These are not things that can actually happen. You have to have money in order to have any kind of system of large scale trade. So the Star Trek moneyless economy thing is not a real thing that could ever happen, for example.
It seems like if people suddenly had to go without it, the function might become more apparent, because we're just used to being able to have prices and understand how to pay for various things, and all of that would break down without some kind of currency, and at least in our current economy, like something as complex as our current economy.
Yeah, I guess kind of an example of you don't know what you have until it's gone, that kind of thing. You don't appreciate it.
Yeah. And even in Star Trek, they are constantly doing things that would require money, or they even do use money, so they can't even hold it up there.
Right, but they have to cheat in order to tell their stories sometimes.
But I think. Go ahead. Well, I had another question to jump in with, if that's appropriate. So just to kind of summarize some of the key points in your talk, it seems like you're saying that there's this computational complexity problem in any kind of medium or large scale economy, and that money solves this, or having some kind of standard unit of value, which is the property of money that you're focusing on, solves this problem. So there's kind of a need that will arise for this, and then you solve it in this way. But that there's in order to have a standard unit of value, you need some kind of stability of that unit's value. That's kind of by definition, but that creates a constraint that might be quite important, which is that the general price level can't really be going up and down too much in whatever you're using as your standard unit of value, or you'll switch to something else. So what you, I think, point to a little bit in the talk is that this can be important as a constraint, because there might be things that would be solved by the general price level going up and down that now can't happen because of this other reason for it not going up and down, or at the very least, it seems like you're emphasizing it as an important constraint. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the consequences of that constraint, and perhaps also tie that in to basic income, if you think that's appropriate as well.
Yeah, so it is a constraint. The stable price level is a constraint, but something to keep in mind is that the real price level is always fixed. So the thing that the nominal price level, or the price level that we usually talk about, it's approximating something that's fixed. There's a fixed real level of prices, and allowing the nominal price level, the price of money, to move around isn't going to get us around the just general sense that there's a fixed frame of reference against which you want to move everything. So you can't use inflation or deflation or changes in the price level to get around the real constraints that underlie everything. And the reason why we want a stable price level is just to efficiently facilitate pricing and payments, and price setting and everything. So does that answer your question?
Well, I guess to try to explain where I was coming from, it seems like if for example, if productivity in an individual industry, if things can adjust, like if productivity goes up, prices can go down, and then people can afford the goods, can afford more of the goods when more of the goods are able to be made available. But at the level of the general price level, if the general price level has to be fixed, then if overall productivity goes up, overall prices can't go down to compensate. That's the kind of constraint that I had in mind, but perhaps I'm misunderstanding that.
No, that's exactly right. I'm just throwing in the caveat that you can't use inflation and deflation to get around this constraint, that the real price level is always fixed. So prices are flexible in individual markets, but they can't be on average flexible in the economy as a whole. And if you try to use inflation to get around that, you're just bringing the nominal price level up to a new level, and you're not really accomplishing anything in terms of productivity or anything like that. Does that make sense?
I have to think about that one a little bit more, but let me think about it. I guess I'm trying to understand what's different with the general price level versus with an individual industry.
Right. It's because at bottom, you can think of each price level as being equivalent to every other price level. So it's just how the money is denominated. So if you switch to we could switch to another price level by saying, well, each dollar is now $10 in the new unit or something like that. And now prices have been multiplied by 10, but the economy hasn't changed at all. So anytime you see inflation or deflation in the real world, what's happening is that it's not happening evenly across all the prices in the economy. So the effects that we tend to associate with inflation are really effects associated with kind of the distributional changes that are associated with that particular inflation, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. You asked about how it connects up with basic income as well. So in terms of keeping a stable price level, you have to think about, well, there's always a flow of money going from consumers to producers and a flow of goods and services going in the opposite direction. So the question is, where does the flow of money come from? And basic income can be one answer to that question. So if consumers are all receiving a basic income and then spending that money, that can be the source of the flow of money in the economy. If you don't have a basic income, then you have to do other things to provide consumers with their money so they can spend in the economy, and not only does it keep the price level matched up with the production level, but it also allows production to be happening. If only 2 people in an economy of 7 billion people actually had any money, that would be kind of broken, right? So the even distribution makes it more efficient. Some of the things we do now to get money to consumers, or one of the main things we do at the macroeconomic level to get money to consumers, is that we stimulate the financial sector. So we use monetary policy to keep interest rates very, very low, and that makes borrowing in the private sector a lot cheaper. So businesses can borrow and hire more employees. So we overstimulate the financial sector, which overstimulates the labor market and creates jobs that we wouldn't otherwise need to have. So basic income is an alternative to that. It's an alternative source of the flow of money in the economy that's perhaps more efficient than what we're doing now.
When you talk about the general price level and basic income, it strikes me that there's kind of two functions or features or problems that money can solve that are kind of different, but they overlap in an interesting way. So there's the standard of value function, the pricing standard. We need a stable reference, in order to set prices. And that's one function. But then the other function is actually getting people stuff, getting people goods. So on one hand, I guess we could say that the function of money is to be this stable standard. And that's sort of why deviation from that is bad. We want to be able to set prices. But on the other hand, then basic income, once you solve that problem, that's not saying very much. Like you could have a stable price level and still have lots of people who are poor, not getting goods. So it seems like basic income comes in and sort of, that's like the function of basic income, right? Then is to actually to get people the goods, whereas money itself is kind of agnostic about that. You can have a stable standard without doing the goods part.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can have a stable money and everything else being totally wrecked in your economy. So basic income is a way to provide that source of money. And when I say it's more efficient than some of these other ways we do it, well, if we overstimulate the financial sector, then that creates asset bubbles and a cycle of recessions and that kind of thing. And some people are left out because they don't get the jobs. And so you can have your stable standard of value, and you can have your money being very kind of efficient just If you look at the money itself and what each token is doing, it's very reliable. But then you have, a financial sector that's in disarray. You have poverty, people being left behind. You have the economy, producing well below what it's capable of, at the same time, perhaps wasting a lot more resources that it needs to waste. So it's really, having a stable currency is kind of a bare minimum of, or it's necessary, but it's not sufficient for a maximally prosperous economy. So basic income is a way of providing that flow of money that helps maximize prosperity.
Yeah, but interestingly, though, the general price level itself is related to stuff being purchased, right? It's related to a flow of money claiming a flow of goods. Now we would, and it's not just us saying this, like today is the general price level is measured in terms of consumer goods, right? So like, I almost wonder if does it even make any sense to talk about a stable price level or a stable standard of value if you're not thinking about consumer goods and money claiming goods. So I'm just wondering, like, how distinct are these two functions, and then how do they overlap?
So the two functions are money being a stable standard versus money claiming goods. Are those the two functions?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, I would say that money claiming goods, that's kind of on the payment standard part. So it's the standard way to claim goods, right? So this is, chartalists especially describe money as kind of a claim ticket. And, in terms of what they would say it would claim, I would say that, yeah, it claims a standard amount of goods and services. So again, the standard is kind of coming in. So that's the medium of exchange part of it as well, that you are exchanging the standard thing to purchase what you want to purchase. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. And I think maybe the question I'm getting at is there a reason, what's the important reason why you would pick the standard of value as the definition of money as opposed to this means of payment? Is it because we can actually settle payments with other stuff? We can settle payments with bartering and exchanging debts. But if it's not happening with the standard means of payment, then we're missing something. And what is it that we're missing there?
Yeah, I mean, we're missing being able to all coordinate with each other. So the benefit of having a standard is that we're all thinking in terms of the same prices. We're all passing around these tokens that we have an intuitive sense of what they're worth, what they'll get. And that just allows trade to be efficient. If everybody had to be kind of calculating prices of one thing in terms of another thing, it gets, this is the computational complexity problem. You have both the problem of how do you compare prices of all these different things, and then you have the problem, the double coincidence of wants problem, where what if the thing you have to trade isn't the thing that other people want, and that kind of thing. So money boils all of that down to a single numeraire good. So economists use the word numeraire, which kind of encapsulates both the money unit and the money token aspect of money. So it's just this standard kind of commodity in terms of which you can price and everything else and trade with everything else. So I like that word, numeraire.
Okay, so coming back to this question of capturing, I guess, getting the most goods from the economy that you can, which is sort of following up on what Derek was talking about. The thought experiment that you've given me before is imagine that, as I said before, the productivity of the whole economy goes up. How do you, or theoretical, I should say the productivity potential of the entire economy goes up. So how do you take advantage of that or capture that? And so how does that relate to the fact that we need this standard unit of value?
Yeah, so if the production potential of the economy goes up, then in order to activate that stream, you need to have a corresponding increase in the stream of money going towards the production. So that's kind of how it connects to the stable price level. Obviously, behind the scenes, the real price level is always fixed. So you can't just allow prices to go. I mean, you could allow prices to kind of go down across the board, but you still need the money to be distributed in such a way that it actually activates the full production. So this is more of a question of so to simplify things, imagine a scenario where everybody spends an equal amount of money and the economy produces more. So there's just a growth in the stream of production, and the stream of money is staying the same. Now prices have gone down across the board. Nothing bad has happened in the economy, except maybe the pricing standard is a little less intuitive because you've had deflation, right? So that's fine, except for the part where the money stops kind of functioning how you want it to be, but everyone's still able to purchase everything that the economy is producing. So I think it's useful to separate those two things. Now, where you run into problems is if there's a distributional change to this. So for example, if everybody's getting their money through jobs and your increased productivity means we don't need as much labor or something like that, or people aren't automatically being paid more corresponding to the increase in production, then you might see a problem where the economy just won't produce because the flow of money hasn't increased. It gets a lot simpler to think about all of this stuff if you think about the price level being fixed, but then you have to think about, well, what mechanisms need to be in place to keep the price level fixed. So there's a concept that I often bring up with people, which is the price elasticity of demand. So that has to do with if prices go up in any individual market, how much will the quantity of stuff being purchased decrease by? So generally, as prices go up, people buy less of that thing, right? If price elasticity of demand is very elastic, that means that if prices go up a little bit, then people will buy a lot less. If it's inelastic, then prices can move around a lot more without really changing the quantities that much. Now, if you look at the economy as a whole and you say, well, what's the price elasticity of aggregate demand? How steep is the aggregate demand curve? Then you might run into problems where if you're in a situation where the price elasticity of demand is fairly inelastic, the quantities might stay the same, even if prices go down. I think the clearest way to think about this is if you imagine an economy where half the people have money and they all have the same amount of money to spend, and then the other half doesn't, then the economy will only produce for the people who have money. It won't produce for the people who don't have money. So then the economy is underproducing and people are getting left behind at the same time. And that can be imagined as a demand curve that's incredibly steep, and price elasticity is incredibly inelastic. If producers lowered their prices even a lot, they're still not going to be able to sell more of their goods because the people who don't have any money are still not going to be able to buy them, no matter how much you lower your prices, unless you lower them to zero or something like that. So the distribution is a key part of this, and it's a key part of why basic income is a more efficient mechanism for distributing money to consumers, because it creates that even distribution so everyone can participate in the economy as a consumer, and producers have the maximum number of potential consumers to produce for.
Thanks. Yeah, so that kind of creates more, though the flatter the distribution, for example, as with the basic income, the more incentive to produce more at lower prices, right, according to what is possible.
Yeah, and what really matters is how flat it is at the point where the prices are being decided, right? Like if there's a few billionaires or trillionaires off to one end of the income distribution, that's not going to hurt anyone, right? What matters is that the prices are fairly elastic where the prices are being determined.
Interesting. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people talking about basic income today. There's not too many advocates for it that are going here and talking about talk about the definition of money at all, much less some sort of revision to it. Why is this important? I mean, why do you bring this up? Why not just say, okay, we sort of have price stability figured out. Let's just get basic income because we're missing that.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with. So people have this intuition that basic income solves certain problems, and different people kind of emphasize different ones. And it's true, basic income solves a lot of different problems. But I think fundamentally there's one thing that's underlying that, which is that the way we get people their money is broken. If you have, you can imagine a world with basic income that distributes money efficiently to all consumers, right? And then you can say, well, what if you don't have that? What kinds of problems will that cause? And so you can work backwards from that direction. And you can say, oh, well, it leads to poverty. poverty. It leads to financial sector instability. It leads to the economy underproducing. It leads to resource waste. It leads to all these bad things that people notice individually might be benefits of basic income. But rather than looking at basic income and kind of creating a laundry list of benefits that it provides, you can say, well, it fixes the way we get people their money, and if that's not broken, then it doesn't cause all these other problems. It's I think a clearer and more direct and concise and complete way of thinking about what basic income is and what it does. And a lot of the people who are talking about basic income, they're not wrong about it solving all these other problems. But if you just talk about those individual other problems, people might think, oh, well, you want people to have higher incomes. Why don't we just raise the minimum wage? Why don't we just provide a job guarantee so everyone has a job, that kind of thing. And that's because if you only see part of the picture and you only see a part of the problem, it looks like there are more effective ways of addressing these individual problems that people tend to talk about when associated with basic income. So that's why I think it's problematic to come at basic income from these other angles, because you get kind of pulled into these alternatives that are alternatives to the specific subproblem, but they're not alternatives to the overall problem of having an efficient way to get money to consumers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it. To understand the benefits of basic income, you have to understand money proper itself first. Otherwise, it's not clear, right? If the problem is people are suffering, they don't have access to resources, it's like, well, maybe we can get those resources to them in some other ways. But then we ignore the fact that money is the most, or one of the most efficient and convenient and standard ways that we get people resources.
Yeah, and there are times when, basic income is for funding consumers in the private sector. There are times when it's more efficient to do things through the public sector, and that's fine. Basic income is for the private sector part of things. It's for when the private sector is more efficient.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add a few things that this perspective adds for me in terms of understanding basic income is, first of all, helping one understand why we might have or how much basic income we're going to be able to afford. Not the exact number, but kind of theoretically, how would you determine that and how would you figure it out? And for example, why it's possible that we could have a certain amount of inflation targeted right now and still potentially be underproducing relative to capacity. I think without understanding like the elasticity of demand and the demand curves that Alex was talking about, it's kind of hard to see why we might be leaving production on the table right now and able to afford people, giving people a basic income and having people get more goods without necessarily immediately taking resources from other areas to compensate. At some point, we might need to be in that position, but we might not be there now. And without understanding this perspective on how money works and how the price level works, I think it's kind of hard to see that. So that can help, that can be relevant to the debate and to thinking about, basic income and the advantages that it has. I think seeing, this idea of the distribution of money and how that affects what goods are actually produced and what people are actually able to get. And I think that's a very different perspective. I think most people, whether they're proponents of basic income or against it or don't even think about it, tend to think of the economy as already pretty much most of the time maxing out its production, such that there's always kind of this zero-sum trade-off that you need to make. So people already think it's operating efficiently in that way. And then there's just a question of who's getting what. And if you see money in the way that Alex has been talking about, you have a secondary issue, which is that money the economy might not even be operating maximally efficiently as it is now, which is also an opportunity to give people more in a non-zero sum way, at least until you get to that point. So that's something else that I think comes out of this perspective and isn't there in a lot of the other basic income conversations, where there's a very detailed debate about where to take things from in order to, give them to somebody else. So that's something, another kind of additional answer to that, Derek.
I think there's this general vague sense among economists that if you see inflation happening or increasing or something like that, then that's a sign that the economy is maxed out, that we're producing everything we can. Or if you see unemployment getting really, really low, that's a sign that we're kind of maxing out the economy's potential. And I'm saying no, that those things aren't necessarily signs of that, especially if the price elasticity of aggregate demand is very inelastic. The way that the central banks currently prop up the price level to maintain, the stable purchasing power of the dollar is, as I was saying, they stimulate the financial sector, and that creates a distribution of consumer spending power that's skewed more towards the people who already have it. So that makes demand less elastic. So that makes it more profitable for producers to produce lower quantities at higher prices, and that's how we keep the price level up. If incomes were distributed more evenly, that would make it more profitable for producers to produce higher quantities at lower prices. So you have, this is how, like I was asking in my talk, I was asking, well, how do you adjust quantities when the price level is fixed? And this is the answer to that question, is that you have to make demand more elastic, and then it makes it more profitable to produce higher quantities.
There's just to go back a little bit in the chat, there's a question: does price elasticity work with needs? And by that, I'm assuming he means he's asking what happens when there's certain goods that people really, really want or really, really require. Is it still the case that you can give them basic income and then prices aren't going to? What stops prices from just getting raised really high for things that people, basic necessities that people are always going to really, really want?
Yeah, so price elasticity does work with needs. Needs are, conventionally thought of as less elastic goods. If there's something you really need, you're going to buy it no matter what the price is, that kind of thing. But if there's something that people really need and the price is really high and you don't give them the money to buy it, then they still won't buy it, right? So certainly, there is an effect with stuff that people really need. If they can't get it, they can't get it. And then they're screwed, and then they're poor and suffering and all of that. And that's very, very bad. But at the level of the macroeconomy, it's a spectrum between wants and needs, right? It's a continuum. So the overall, and then the resources that go into producing things that people need are, sometimes overlap with the resources that go into producing other goods and services. So you can, at the level of the macroeconomy, kind of average it out. So he's saying healthcare, water, food. So water and food, especially food, is very easy to, if people have money to buy food, they're going to buy food. It's very easy for the market to distribute food. Water is more of a utility. It would be inefficient to have like a competitive market of people who are trying to sell you water. Instead, you want like one system of pipes that sends water to everybody's homes and that kind of thing. So you might expect that to be managed by a local government. Healthcare is very, very complicated. We did a whole one of these discussions on healthcare, but generally speaking, especially for the big stuff that people talk about, Medicare for all, or government subsidized healthcare or government provided healthcare is probably the most efficient option for a lot of things. I would say that in terms of things that the government needs to provide for the people, universal healthcare is very similar to universal basic income. And the arguments for both are similar. This is something that everybody needs, that it's most efficient for the government to provide.
Can we switch to a Perry Merling question?
Yeah.
From your talk. Yeah, so one thing that Perry Merling brought up is he argued that, or he was suggesting that you were saying that the price level is exogenous, sort of, set by some institution or by the property of gold or whatever, and that he thinks that it's endogenous and kind of determined by the same things that determine other prices that he talks about, like interest or whatever. And so I was wondering if you would speak to that a little bit. Is it endogenous? Is it exogenous? Is that just a semantic distinction, depending on what you mean by those words? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so the prices of things are generally determined by the market. What's special about money and why the market chooses a particular thing to use as its money is that its price is resistant to market forces. And that can be just something that is generally valued by a lot of people. So market forces aren't going to push it around very much. It's consistently, reliably valued. And that's why we used commodity standards like gold and silver and that kind of thing. Or it can be that institutions are making a promise, right? It could be, when we talk about debt, a debt is an IOU for a certain amount of something. So when institutions are making promises, the central bank is making a promise that you're going to be able to buy a certain amount of goods and services with your money, that you're going to be able to claim a certain amount of the economy's output, then in that sense, it's exogenous to the market. If you're just sitting inside the market, this is like a stable fixed frame of reference that sits outside the market, or that originates outside the market, on which the market can kind of hang itself and set its prices and that kind of thing. So in that sense, money as a thing, or in terms of its price, is exogenous to the market. It doesn't respond to market forces. There are people who talk about endogenous money, like endogenous money theorists. They're talking about something a little bit different. They're talking about, well, is the amount of money in the economy exogenous or endogenous? Is the amount of money flowing through the economy endogenous? And their argument is that if you set the price of money, like the central bank sets interest rates or influences interest rates and that kind of thing, then a certain amount of money will have to be created to match whatever that price is. And in that sense, the amount of money out there, the amount of money flowing through the economy, is endogenous. But it depends on where you draw the line in your model, right? Like we could have a model of central banks, and we could say that a stable price level is endogenous because it's necessary for markets. It's necessary for markets to function. So the central banks don't have a choice. They really are. There's this greater natural constraint that central banks face in keeping the price level stable. And I would agree with that. The mechanisms that central banks and other economic policies use to keep the price level stable, those are endogenous to the fact that the market needs a stable standard of value. But I would still say that ultimately the stable standard of value is exogenous. The need for that, it's just part of nature.
That makes sense, but I'm wondering what you think Per Mehrling was getting at, because he was talking about things like the depression, deflation during the Great Depression being caused by, trading or dealers. I forget exactly what his point was. So I think he was trying to point to examples where the actual price level changed as a result of endogenous forces.
Yeah, so I would say that these are failures of money being managed properly. So in those cases, if the money was being managed properly, the monetary authorities would have pushed back against those market forces and canceled them out. So that was a failure of properly functioning money. If the ideal properly functioning money is not, the price level is not going to move at all ever.
So I guess you would say, sorry, and I'll wrap up, that market forces would push the general price level around, or do push it around, but then you need some countervailing pressure to use that thing as a standard unit of value.
Yeah, and ideally you would push back before the market forces even pushed in one direction. And we became more proactive in our monetary policy after the Great Depression, precisely for that reason. A lot of people said, well, the central banks didn't do what they were supposed to do, and that's why all this happened, that kind of thing. But it's important to understand that there are always going to be, money's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be that ideal that I talked about. There are going to be times when there's inflation, deflation, that kind of thing. But we do the best we can. And as long as we get kind of close enough to a stable standard, there's kind of this network effect where in this convention where everybody's already using this standard, it takes a lot to rip people away from that existing standard. But it has happened. It does happen. If you have like a hyperinflation or something like that, and the authorities completely lose control of the money, then people will find something else to set their prices in and to make payments with as well.
You're talking a lot here about central banks managing money for the economy. Some money theorists, chartists, and others have pretty strong feelings about who should or shouldn't manage the money. Some people might say it shouldn't be central banks, it should be the government, or vice versa. Do you have anything? Does this theory of yours have anything to say about who does the managing? Is there anything important about what kind of institution is the one doing this?
Yeah, well, right now, conventionally, it is the central banks. It doesn't have to be the central banks. You could instead have a mandate that the government itself, the fiscal authority, has to spend in a way that keeps the price level stable. Or even you could have a basic income authority. It's like you got to set the basic income at whatever level is going to keep the price level stable. And then you could say to the central bank, your job is only to manage the stability of the financial sector. So if you need to raise interest rates to rein in private sector credit and asset bubbles and that kind of stuff, go ahead and do that. These other guys will take care of the price level. I think that would actually be a pretty good way of doing things. If the central bank was really only responsible for financial sector stability, and then the fiscal authority was only really responsible for allocating resources for the public good, and then the basic income, authority or whoever can kind of pick up the slack in the middle and fill in that gap. Then you could have a financial sector that's much smaller, but people still, a stable price level and a more stable distributed production stream and a stable distributed money stream. going at the same time.
Oh, this is an important point, I think, because it renders your view, you get to become a little agnostic, right, on this question of who's doing it. A lot of people get into a lot of arguments about, whether the government should be involved or not, that sort of thing. Yeah. But by defining money this way functionally, you get to say, well, that's not super important. But a lot of people these days, I've noticed, talk about money with a chartalist understanding. That's there at least implicitly, the idea that well, the government can create money because it's the government, because it occupies this special place. But that's not really the case in this view, right? Like, we don't need to make that argument. The government could be the one doing it, but what's important is how successful they are at managing the standard, right?
Yeah, that's right. And governments are certainly in the position to influence markets in such a way that they can provide a more stable form of money than anyone else really could. They're just in that position, right? But that doesn't mean that the nature of money has to do with that. And if the governments fail to do that, then the market will find something to use as its money.
For those who don't know, you got to present a summary of this paper at the Money View Symposium. You got to get some feedback from Perry Merling, who I know is an economist that you've taken a lot of inspiration from. I think he correctly identified that you're making a claim, you're making a case about the nature of base money, right? About what it is, what makes base money special or different, how does it connect to the general price level? If I remember correctly, he did have a couple questions or objections, and the ones I remember are he observed that very little of the money in circulation or being spent is claiming consumer goods. There's a lot of it in the financial sector, and that, of course, he's thinks is very important. And then he also, I think, if I remember correctly, said that some of what you're saying reminds him of quantity theory of money, which he's skeptical of. What was your response to those, and what was your reaction to his take in general?
Yeah, so I always like getting feedback from Perry Merling. So in terms of the amount of money going towards goods and services, that's right. A vanishingly small amount of it is being used to buy goods and services, and most of it is being spent to buy financial assets, right? And it's money markets and capital markets and all of that. That's where all the volume is. But the goods are very important in the same sense that even when we were on a gold standard, most of the money wasn't being traded for gold or being redeemed for gold or that kind of thing. But the gold is very important to the whole system functioning properly. The stability against the peg to gold was what underlay the stability of the gold standard. And when money isn't an IOU for gold, today it's an IOU for goods and services, and that means having a stable price level. So even if people aren't using it for that most of the time, it's still very, very important. And everyday people, in terms of our ordinary lives, that is what we're using it for, right? Like, I'm not trading financial assets or that kind of thing, and I still use money, and that's what it is for people. So yeah, I think the connection to goods and services, that money, not just base money, but all money is ultimately an IOU for goods and services, and you can spend those money tokens to buy goods and services, and the government is making promises about how much stuff you can buy with your money. That's super important. And without the connection to the goods market, without money being connected to goods, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. So it's really crucial. The connection to goods is really crucial. So money is an IOU for goods and services, and that's what the price level is. That's saying, like, you get a certain amount of stuff for a certain number of tokens, and those flows have to match up with each other. And then the other question was, what was it?
I remember he said that your theory of the general price level here, with a certain amount of money claiming a certain amount of goods, that it started to sound like QTM, like quantity theory of money. What was your response to that?
So the quantity theory of money basically says that the price level is determined by the amount of money out there. What I'm saying is that the price level is determined by the relationship between the flow of money and the flow of goods and services going in the opposite direction. So if you keep the flow of goods and services fixed, then the flow of money will determine the price level. And if you say that a certain amount of money being in the economy implies a certain flow, now your quantity theory of money. So I think that's kind of what he was picking up on. But I actually don't, I don't think in terms of there being a fixed amount of production. And I don't think of the flow of money as being, the flow of spending as being fixed relative to the quantity of money out there, which I think is actually really hard to define. There are some relationships there empirically, but even those empirical relationships can change as we start to use different forms of money, right? Like there used to be a relationship between the amount of cash that was out there and perhaps the price level that you could empirically point to. But now, people spend using debit cards and it's more, digital money, that kind of thing. It feels a little bit like quantity theory of money because you're talking about a quantity of something. You're talking about a quantity of spending, but it's I have some problems with just like the pure quantity theory. Okay, there's an amount of money out there, and that determines the price of everything.
Right, and it's because quantity theory of money isn't quite right that we can't just say, well, the most of money is sitting around in savings or it's sitting in financial assets, so that's what money is all about. It's actually, to understand the general price level, we have to look specifically at the flow of spending chasing goods
in the consumer economy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but you're trying to say that there's an important relationship there between that and money itself. And what I find interesting is that when it comes to the general price level, right, central banks are already very formally, right, had said, okay, it's a basket of consumer goods, right? We're going to measure inflation with this basket of goods. And it doesn't even actually make sense to talk about inflation outside of reference to that because they're deliberately excluding all this other stuff. They're trying to figure out what's in the consumer goods basket. And I'm just wondering, like, why is this sort of an oversight? Like when it comes to theories of the general price level and inflation, like why is it that operationally central banks already have made that determination, but we seem to be missing this piece in our general theories of inflation?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Obviously, you could choose to make the money an IOU for anything. Historically, we made it an IOU for gold, but the reason why we chose gold was because it was stable relative to consumer prices. You could make it stable with respect to wages, just keep people's wages stable. You could decide, hey, we want to keep the basic income fixed over forever and just stabilize it with respect to that. Or there's a lot of things you could stabilize it with respect to. And I think the intuition is that in order for money to be maximally efficient, in order for prices to be maximally efficient, people need to be not thinking about what the unit is worth. Like that's just kind of the basis for all the other prices. So you need to not be thinking about inflation or deflation or thinking about, in your day-to-day lives, you're buying consumer goods. On average, you're buying whatever the market basket is of consumer goods in the consumer price index. So that's kind of like the best we can get. And as you say, central banks have figured this out. They've figured out, maybe they hadn't figured it out in the 19th century, but certainly once we moved past the gold standard, and even a little bit before that, especially in the United States, the central bank in the 1920s, the Fed wasn't as much worried. We had so much gold that it was just kind of overflowing the central bank that we weren't as much worried about keeping the peg to gold. We just started, trying to keep consumer prices more stable. Central banks figured that out. And I think it's natural that they did because if they hadn't, we'd be running into a lot of problems. But that doesn't mean it automatically goes into academic circles as much.
Right, out of necessity, it's done. But if you ask the question why, like presumably there's a reason why, and if you start thinking about why consumer goods instead of something else, I think maybe that leads us inevitably towards something like consumer monetary theory. Yeah,
and we talk about out of necessity, it's just done, and that's great. But I would argue that we also need a basic income, and it's not being done. So just because we need something to happen doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen, or that it's going to happen at a particular time. We weren't targeting the price level in the 19th century.
I think it's also interesting to notice just that there are so many dollars or whatever, there is so much money happening that isn't about buying goods in terms of volume. And that's kind of its own puzzle, I think, from an everyday perspective, because intuitively, of course, we think money is about the goods that it can claim or the services, the things that people want. And there's some degree to which it's like a point system if you're super, super rich or something. But clearly that's like secondary. And so I think Perry Mehrling offers some perspective on that. You would understand this better than I, but in terms of like a lot of different transactions have to happen in order for payments to happen sometimes. So it's almost like a bit, I don't want to say artificial, but it like looks like it's like a lot of volume of trades, but that doesn't mean that what's important isn't kind of like you buying the apple with a credit card or whatever. And, maybe a second one is this thing you've pointed out about the financial sector just getting so big so that some of the money can like trickle the people to buy goods. But maybe you have more thoughts on this puzzle of like, why is it that if, you look at just where the dollars are and where the transactions are, it's outsized, things that most people don't think about and don't have anything to do with buying goods or services?
Well, part of the answer to that question is that it doesn't have to be that way. That if we fund consumers through the basic income instead of through stimulating the financial sector, that allows us to shrink the financial sector. That allows us to shrink all the stuff that Perry Maryling likes to talk about and make it less relevant in the real world. And I don't know how he feels about that. But there's always a role for a financial sector and all of that. But it doesn't have to be what it is today. It doesn't have to be the source of consumer spending. You don't have to like grow it so big that the tiny little trickle is enough to fund consumers, that kind of thing, if you have a basic income.
That's my one point of frustration with the money view, really, because I really enjoy it outside of that. But most people I talk to are concerned about the real economy, the consumer economy, stuff getting produced, and that's super important. And all the private financial sector stuff is really interesting, but I also feel like there's a limitation to how far you can get just clawing through the details of that if we're neglecting the real side of things, the good side of things.
Yep. So I don't know if we want to wrap up. We're at the end of our hour, unless you have a burning question.
I think that covered most of it. Is there anything else you want to add, Bethany?
No, I'm happy to wrap up, Alex. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
All right, then I'm going to talk about exchange rates and how inflation works in an economy that's a very small country, and they're getting a lot of their stuff through trade. So some people worry that the stuff that I'm talking about doesn't really apply to international trade. So the way I like to think about the international economy is that you have your domestic economy, and then you have, if you're importing, you have all these producers, these global producers in foreign economies, foreign countries. And then it's still fundamentally about matching the flow of spending to the flow of production, except now it's the flow of spending on imports to the volume of goods and services that you're importing. So in terms of managing that, there's less flexibility there, of course. If all of your producers, your foreign producers, decided to raise their prices, then maybe you'd have to just cut the flow of money coming out of your economy in half to keep the price level in your domestic economy stable. But it's still fundamentally the same kind of thing. You can apply this framework even in the context of foreign exchange. And that's it. That's my final
Thanks,
thought.
Alex. Important.
Yeah. Okay, guys, this is a great discussion. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all the questions. Next week's topic, we're talking about Medlock thought. So there's a person who goes by the pseudonym of James Medlock on Twitter, and he's been gaining some popularity on econ Twitter. He likes to promote social democracy and what he calls tax positivity. So what do we think about his views? We're going to be getting into that next week.